Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Trek Wars at OSU. My name is Dr. Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm also the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures here at Oregon State. The Anarres Project for Alternative Futures is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that try to imagine a future free of exploitation, domination, oppression, war, and empire to the fullest extent possible. And one of our projects is Trek Wars at OSU, in which we try to use big sci-fi franchises such as Star Trek and Star Wars to help us make sense of the political, social, economic, and cultural realities of our society today. And so our episode today has to do with swearing in Star Trek. This episode was inspired by a comment that Dr. Christina Alabak made in one of our last episodes in which we were talking about Star Trek Picard. And she mentioned that one of the things that put her off about Star Trek Picard is the amount of profanity and swearing that is in the series. And I started to investigate this, and I started to look at it, and I found out that many, many different fans of Star Trek, longtime fans, are put off by the use of profanity in Star Trek. In fact, there's all sorts of different blogs and articles that have been written about this, but there is also a video that has been produced that sort of talks about all the different kinds of ways in which profanity was used, particularly in Picard. And so let me share that with you now. Be warned, there's some salty language in this, as of course you would expect, but this gives you just a taste a little bit of all the swearing that goes on in Star Trek Picard.
Sheer fucking hubris.
Shut the fuck up.
Cheeky fuckers.
I hate that fucking hospitality.
Somebody else could buy that fucking synth. Why does it have to be me?
Sorry, I had to fucking ruin it.
You want to be ass deep in Romulans for the rest of your life.
It's like my knowledge of Medusan astrogation techniques totally gone.
Will run the risk of pissing me off.
Piss off.
Pissing off.
Piss off.
That's bullshit. And my ass gets fired.
Now here is some brown sticky shit.
Security alert.
Have you fucked any of them? I'm not their mother, asshole.
And don't think we won't kick your ass, dirtbag, because we will.
Raph. And then I fucking did it again.
Spock,
Yes.
about those colorful metaphors that we've discussed, I don't think you should try using them anymore.
So this was a mashup that was done by a Star Trek fan to talk about the ways in which this seems out of place in the Star Trek universe, that people don't do this in Star Trek. And so I started looking around and I realized that there's a whole discussion about this. And so I wanted to share with you some reflections that I had about profanity and swearing in the Star Trek universe, and the ways in which profanity is used and what does it say about our society. So I wanted to talk about Star Trek and the uses of profanity. Now, the interesting thing is that Star Trek Picard was not the first series to drop the F-bomb. In fact, the use of the F-bomb was from Star Trek Discovery. In the season 1, episode 5, Choose Your Pain, there is a scene in which Ensign Sylvia Tilly gets very excited about having working on this spore drive, and she says, "You guys, this is so fucking cool." And Engineer Stamets, which you see here, turns to her, and at first he appears a little bit shocked about what she says, but then he turns around and says, "It is fucking cool." And this displays, I think, one of the different kinds of uses of profanity, but this created a huge kind of uproar in the blogosphere about how this was taking Star Trek in a direction that many fans did not like. And so I started to look to see what were the different arguments that people had about why profanity was not something that they appreciated being used in Star Trek. So what I found was that most of the arguments are around something like this. And so what you see here is a video or a shot of Admiral Clancy, right? In the episode, one of the early episodes in Picard, Admiral Picard, retired, has to go to Starfleet to ask for a special dispensation from Starfleet to use a ship to go on a mission. And Admiral Clancy here is shocked by the fact that he would even come and ask for this. And so the use of the F-bomb in this particular scene really set a lot of people off. A lot of people said, look, this is something that old Trek just simply didn't do. And so it's not something that is in the Trek universe, and so it's just out of place. But people started also to make some much more kinds of philosophical arguments about the use of profanity. Some people started to say, well, look, people in the future just simply don't curse or use swear words. Other people started to say things like people simply don't swear in a utopia, right? Why would you want to swear in a world that's perfect like the Federation? So it doesn't make any sense that people would be swearing in Star Trek. And then another argument, it was simply sort of a practical one, is that many people were disappointed by the fact that they couldn't watch Star Trek with their kids because of the use of profanity, and they felt that this was not a good influence for their children to see on screen. Now, what's interesting about this is that the head writer and showrunner for Star Trek Picard had to come out on social media and address some of these concerns in March of 2020. And what he said was, look, the reason that old Trek didn't use profanity was because they couldn't. The Federal Communications rules did not allow profanity in network television. And so old Trek didn't have swearing because they couldn't portray that on television. But he said that just simply because it wasn't portrayed doesn't mean that it didn't happen. This argument that people don't swear in the future, Chabon said, just doesn't seem to make sense. And this doesn't seem to make sense to me either, particularly if you think about something like the word fuck. The earliest uses of this, and there are a lot of linguists who debate about this, but the earliest uses of this the research has come out to suggest that the earliest use of the word fuck is in court documents in England from about 1310. So if those are accurate, that means that we have been using this word for over 700 years. In a variety of different ways, and of course becoming all the more creative as time goes by with how we can use this word and what the contexts are. And so to believe that a word that we've been using for almost 700 years would somehow mysteriously disappear in the next 200 to 300 years does in fact seem a little bit unrealistic. Chabon also argued that this idea that people won't use profanity in a utopia seems to really not acknowledge human psychology, that the Federation in the future is a kind of utopia, but it's not perfect and it's not static, and human affairs are never just stuck in a bottle and will not change. And to the effect that human beings are always trying to work to change and to make themselves better, there's always going to be slight imperfections. And Chabon suggests that to that extent, there will always be moments in which you will want to express yourself in this kind of way. And so I'll address the question about watching Star Trek with your kids and not being able to watch it because of profanity in a second. But I wanted to sort of think about this, right? If there's a worry about the use of profanity and that maybe we wouldn't in the future, or that a utopia doesn't really allow for the use of profanity, what is profanity for, right? What exactly is the reason that human beings engage in swearing? And so there's a variety of different kinds of responses to this that I want to share with you. So why do we curse? I think one of the most interesting responses is the work by cognitive scientist Benjamin Bergen, who is a cognitive scientist at the University of California, San Diego. And in his 2016 book, What the Fuck? What Swearing Reveals About Our Language, Our Brains, and Ourselves, he posits that swearing is useful in two ways. It's used as a way to vent or release strong feelings, right? So it's a sort of psychological tool that we use when we're sort of bent up and boiling over with different kinds of feelings, particularly kinds of things like anger. So it's a way to vent or release. But also, it's a way of expressing emotion intensely. And this is slightly different. It's not just simply a valve for releasing tension, but it can be a way to punctuate emotional moments. And so he tries to give us a kind of way of categorizing different swear words. And he notes that historically in our society and in most societies, right, swear words fall into different kinds of categories. There are swear words that are associated with sex, like fuck. There are swear words that are associated with bodily processes and functions, shit, piss. There's the classic sorts of swear words that have to do with religious faith. So go to hell or God damn. These are tied with taboos about taking Lord's name in vain and other sorts of ways of thinking about these kinds of religious functions and taboos. And of course, there are those swear words that are tied with ethnic slurs that are meant to name entire groups of people. And these categories are important for Bergen for the following purposes, because he believes that swearing can have constructive and destructive purposes. So destructive purposes in particular, you can sort of see with the use of things like ethnic slurs, right? An ethnic slur, like using the N-word, is a way to try to degrade or to remove the dignity of a group of people by using that particular word against them. That's a particular kind of destructive use of profanity, because it's about removing moral respect from a certain group of people. But he wants to say that there are also constructive or therapeutic uses of profanity that are fairly profound, right? And so what are the constructive uses of profanity? For Bergen, what we need to understand is that, in some sense, the capacity for swearing is deeply rooted in the brain, right, in brain structure. And so what many different folks have noticed about swearing is that one of the things that's true about it is that when the brain has suffered different kinds of trauma, either through injury or through disease, that even though different parts of the brain can be destroyed, one of the things that remains oftentimes, and for instance, in folks who have suffered strokes, is the capacity for swearing. Right. So seems to be something that is part of the sort of deep structure of the brain. What's also interesting about this is that swearing functions as a painkiller. So studies have shown that people who swear when they are experiencing pain have a sense of reduction of that pain through the use of swearing and using profane words. So one study looked to see whether there was pain reduction if you swore using profanity versus if you swore using words like, oh, fudge. And respondents in the study showed that there was more pain reduction if you used real profane language when there was an injury, as opposed to the kind of fudge words. So swearing functions as a kind of painkiller. It emits some kind of ability for human beings to self-soothe. And what's also important for Bergen is this idea that he mentions, that the emotional effects of swearing is that profanity has the ability to punctuate emotional urgency in a speaker's utterances. Swearing indicates that a person needs to have attention and that they're looking for some kind of affirmation by using profanity. And so this is often, people often think that people who swear are not as intelligent, or they have diminished vocabulary. And in fact, studies show that quite the opposite, is that people who swear quite a bit often have much larger vocabularies. And the use of profanity here is as a rhetorical device to, as I said, to punctuate the emotional urgency of an utterance. Now, something I would add to this too, that the Bergen doesn't talk about, is that swear words are really philosophically interesting and perhaps philosophically useful. They can be technical terms. And so I owe this sort of thinking to the work of Harry Frankfurt and his work on bullshit. For Frankfurt, bullshit refers to a certain kind of speech act, right? There's a kind of way in which one bullshits. Right. And bullshit is a kind of thing when someone utters speech in order to persuade someone else, but the person who is using bullshit doesn't care about the truth or about the facts of what they're talking about. So, for instance, there's a difference between a bullshitter and a liar. A liar is someone who deceives, who's trying to keep facts or the truth of something from you in order to get you to believe something so that they can have one up on you. So a liar is concerned with the truth. They just don't want to share it with you. A bullshitter, on the other hand, is someone who doesn't care whether what they say is true or not. Their whole intent is just getting you to believe in what they are saying to you. And Frankfurt, I think in May of 2016, in a very controversial Time magazine article, said that the supreme kind of example of someone who engages in bullshitting is President Donald Trump. Someone who is not interested in being truthful or using the facts, but simply will speak in a way that tries to convince you that the way they see things is the way that you ought to see things. And so bullshit has really important technical kinds of terms to sort of think about our relationship to the truth. Now, want to think about something that another theorist has thought of. This is the neuroscientist Emma Byrne. And she agrees with Bergen that there is a kind of important way in which profanity punctuates emotional urgency in a speaker. But she notes that there's a double standard in swearing. Swearing does have this rhetorical effect of insisting that the speaker's emotions be heard and affirmed, right? But in our society, because of patriarchy and sexism, people are often socialized in ways that create this double standard in swearing. Women, for instance, are socialized either not to swear because it's thought of as unladylike or coarse, or to swallow their emotions and not to express them, right? And so someone who swears, who is a woman, is thought of as a nasty woman, right? Someone who's unladylike. Men are socialized in this patriarchal sexist society not to affirm women's emotions at all, especially anger. And I think that this is really interesting, this particular take, because it does show something about the ways in which people have been reacting to Star Trek and the use of swearing. In particular, when you look at who has dropped the F-bomb in Star Trek, a lot of them have been women. And a lot of the reaction against this has been because of these particular women. So here you see, right, the very first instance of the use of fucking in Star Trek, right? Ensign Tilly here is in this scene with Stamets in which they're talking about the spore drive. And she says, "You guys, this is so fucking cool." Here, this is a really classic case in which profanity is being used to punctuate an emotional reaction. Here, not anger, but excitement, right? Tilly is trying to show that she's really excited and interested in the work that she's doing and that she loves science. And so Stamets turns around and he affirms her emotions by mirroring back to her the use of profanity. He says, it is fucking cool. Right, so there's a strong emotion being used here, and one that's about excitement, intensity, and this is a very common use of this word, and something that someone like Tilly, who often says that she's very jittery and she loves feeling feelings, this is something that would come naturally to a person like this. And so there are many people who say that the use of fucking, and particularly in this scene, is lazy writing. And I would say quite the opposite. I think it's quite accurate to sort of say that someone like Tilly, who is overcome by her emotions and she's trying to hold on to her emotions most of the time and to stem them in, this is something that someone like that would do. Again, too, I think with Admiral Clancy, many people have said, look, this is just a really bad scene. Clancy is taking out this kind of anger on him in a way that's inappropriate, and a commander or a leader should never use this kind of language with a peer or subordinate. It's just unprofessional. And again, I have to say that I think it's very interesting that people are saying this about a woman admiral, right? So again, I think that there's a double standard being used here, is that if this was a male admiral, might not be the same sort of reaction to the swearing. But I think that, again, this is an accurate portrayal of the use of this word, right? Admiral Clancy, from her perspective, feels that Admiral Picard, in his request to take out a ship so that he can go off exploring, is just totally out of place. From her understanding of what he's saying, that there's a Romulan conspiracy to upend the Federation, and that there are these synthetic life forms out there, sounds totally fantastic and wild to her. And given her position of responsibility, all of this just angers her. And so I think that the use of profanity in something like this situation seems totally appropriate, and again is punctuating, right, a kind of emotional intensity. Here, the case of anger, but I think that part of the reaction here is that we are socialized in a society to think that women's use of profanity for the expression of anger or any kind of intense emotion is inappropriate. So finally, what about the children? What about the argument that watching Discovery and Picard is something that parents can't do because they don't want to expose their children to profanity? Well, this is a personal choice, and parents have different kinds of levels of tolerance about what they want to expose their children to. But the reality is that studies show is that there doesn't seem to be any kind of harm to exposing children to media that has profanity. There is no good social scientific evidence to suggest that this somehow harms or damages children, or that it even encourages profane use in children, or that it somehow dumbs them down or anything of that sort. As we've seen, of course, studies do indicate that, and just quite some of the opposite is that people who swear a lot also tend to be people who have larger vocabularies, who are people who tend to use profanity in ways that are rhetorically acute rather than rhetorically dumbed down. So it would seem that watching Picard and Discovery are things that you could do with your children, as long as you talk with them carefully about the use of profanity. And it's something that I think that probably parents should be talking with their children in terms of media usage anyways. So I'm not clear that Discovery and Picard are particularly more dangerous for your children. But if you're concerned with this, right, the answer should simply be, there's over 50 years of different kinds of Star Trek episodes that don't have profanity because of the FCC rules. And so if you want to expose your children to Star Trek, start with TNG, Voyager, maybe stay away from DS9, a little dark, Enterprise, lots of different kinds of shows that talk about the Star Trek universe in ways without using profanity. Then you can bring them up to Discovery and Picard. All right. Thanks for spending a little bit of time with us talking about the ways in which profanity in Star Trek may, in fact, reveal a sexist double standard in terms of the way that profanity is used in society. Hit us up with some comments if you're interested in sharing with us your thoughts, or check out some of our other videos that we have. If you'd like to get a hold of us, leave us a comment or send us some messages at our website, anarresproject.org. We're also available at Anarres Project, all one word, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. Look forward to hearing your thoughts. And once again, live long and prosper.